Hello and welcome to Real Hi-Fi Help. Well, let's take a look at the most ridiculous headphone ever. We're talking about the Abyss AB 1266 model, and I've heard this model and it's absolutely fantastic. So yeah, let's try and see what he has to say about that from Joshua.
Hey, what's up guys? My name is Josh and welcome to the Abyss warehouse. Abyss was kind enough to allow me to film in here and I'm using their facilities, and I want to send a huge shout out to DMS specifically, but also the Abyss team. Now I'm actually in this area for personal reasons and it doesn't actually have anything to do with Abyss. They're not sponsoring, paying, or covering travel, nothing along those lines. So their influence in this review is absolutely zero. But I still do want you to take this with a grain of salt because I am in their facility using their products. They've been very, very generous and very nice. So take it as you will. I do want to state here as a quick disclaimer to this entire video, I am using unfamiliar equipment with an unfamiliar headphone in a strange place. So that definitely factors into my experience with this headphone, and it's hard to say if it's better or worse because of it. So I am very familiar with the Diana V2 and the Diana Fi. I use them pretty much every day at home. I'm pretty experienced with how those headphones sound, so that's what I was coming from into the 1266 review. And the full name for the 1266 that I'm using right now is actually the Abyss AB 1266 Fi TC. And this whole headphone is ridiculous. It's ridiculous through in and throughout. The build is ridiculous, the looks are ridiculous, the sound is ridiculous. It's just a whole lot of ridiculousness going on here. In fact, the build is so ridiculous that they actually ran over one of them with a Jeep.
Well, it's a little scratched up, but you know, what are you gonna do?
So I want to get some brief specs right out of the way. It's got a 66mm driver. It's about 100 grams less than an LCD4, but it's still about 640 grams, so it's still pretty heavy. It's 47 ohms, which is actually a decent bit for a planar, and it has a sensitivity level of about 88 dB. So what all that translates to is you are definitely going to want an amplifier with this headphone, and it's a pretty transparent headphone like we'll talk about in a second. Yeah. So you'll definitely want a good amplifier. Also, on a brief side note, the higher end cable for this thing is ridiculously nice. And I just think it looks so cool. Okay, so the pads for this headphone are a strange take. You'll notice on the inside plastic ring that are magnetically sealed to the headphone, there's all these cutouts for the mounts into the headphone. They have these kind of six screws that go in there that kind of lock the pad in place onto the headphone, as well as close the actual headphone chassis itself. Now this is very different from the Diana, which is only 4 pins, and the pads are kind of shaped in a specific way to where you can't really orientate them in any other way because of how they're cut. Now these pads are shaped in a way and have more articulation at points to where you can really put this in a place that really conforms to your head and is very comfortable. In fact, one of the strange things about this headphone in general is actually how modular the design is and how modular the sound is because of the design. And I'll explain that a little bit here. So one of the things that this headband allows you to do, while it looks ridiculous, like I said, lots of ridiculousness, it allows you to kind of toe in and toe out the angle of the driver, have the headband spread a little bit further apart or collapse a little bit closer. And all of this actually has a substantial impact on how it sounds. So for example, if you want a little bit more forward imaging, you kind of toe the drivers in a little bit more and it kind of stages more in front of you. You want a little bit more bass, you kind of slide the headphones back and actually reduce the amount of seal you have on the rear of your ear. And it actually, depending on how much you do that, substantially impacts the bass response. You can have it a little bit stronger, a little bit thinner, really whatever you prefer. Now, I want to make a quick statement here, because if you were to grab this headphone and just throw it on your head any which way without playing with it, like if you were at a show or at a friend's house, you're going to get one version of the sound. And that's different from most other headphones where there's not really too many ways they can sound. You just slap them on your head. This has some benefits and some detriments. The benefits are that you can actually specifically tailor the sound to what you want it to sound like within the given range of what the headphone can do. The detriments are that kind of once you set it, you kind of have to do that every time in order to get the ideal sound quality for you. So, you know, if you'd put it on your head, you kind of adjust it, tilt it back and forth a little bit, push it, further back on your ears or push them a little bit more forward. And then when you put it down, you have to redo that every time. And that could be a little bit taxing, I suppose. But if you're looking for like ideal sound quality every single time you listen to it, if you're willing to put in the work, this headphone will reward you. So this headphone is supposed to be kind of designed to almost float on top of your head. And I haven't been able to get the comfort of it to reach that level of kind of feeling like I never have a really awkward big headphone on my head. So there's not really a whole lot you can do for comfort in general for a 640 gram headphone. They're almost always going to be a little bit more taxing than a lightweight headphone is to wear. Now, from my personal experience, they have made the comfort a little bit better since the last time I heard it a couple years back at a show, but it's still not a fitment type I particularly enjoy. Now, normally I would talk about amplifiers in this section, but the amplifiers that I'm using are very high-end, but they're very strange to me. And because they're unfamiliar to me, it's hard to tell what's the headphone and what's the amp. So I am sort of reviewing this as an entire system, but I did listen to a few different amps and kind of subtracted the outstanding features from the equation and stuck with things that seem to be consistent through all the amplifiers. So true of all the Abyss products that I have heard, including the Dianas, including the 1266, the sound coming out of this is very much the sound of what industrial equipment would sound like if it were to produce sound. It has a very almost mechanical, not stiff, but it's just like super precise sound.
I kind of agree.
You really hear the precision in everything. And detail is a huge staple of this headphone, and I'm sure you've heard other reviews talk about it, and I think it's absolutely true. This headphone is a detailed monster.
Yep.
Now, the treble response is where this all starts and kind of trickles into the rest of the music. And the treble response is really what establishes the detail retrieval for the entire song. It is what I would consider to be hyper detailed. More detailed than the HE1000 SE for sure, more detailed than the Diana V2 and the Diana Fi. Probably the most detailed headphone I think I've ever heard. Now, the treble response is fast, forward, and present, but it's not burdened by things like resonance issues or bright peaks. So it's available, it's accessible, in fact more than accessible, but it doesn't hit you with this harshness and this unpleasantness that a lot of other headphones that have very fast, very detailed, and very forward treble can. So very technically impressive from my perspective. Now, one thing that I found in the testing that I was able to do with this guy is that the treble is very responsive to what amps you're using. So if you're using really bright amps, you're gonna get a lot of forwardness, and it's probably even gonna be a little bit unpleasant. But if you're using a smoother amplifier, you're also gonna get rewarded for that. I actually think that a sound quality somewhere in between an analytical and a smooth amp is probably the best way to go. Something in what would be considered the neutral territory. I think this headphone is going to play the best with that sort of amplifier. But I do think you're going to have to put in some legwork in finding amps that work and pair well with this and get kind of that really nice system synergy that we all hear about. So I want to talk a little bit about the detail and how the detail comes in on this headphone and how you hear it. It is very different than a lot of other detailed headphones because it is clear and crisp, but almost to the point of seeming a little alien. Like it's almost a little strange. It's almost a little too clear for what normal life or realistic sound would sound like. Now, it's not producing anything that's not in the music, so it's all there, but you definitely feel like you're listening to some sort of transient, extra layered system of sound that you don't normally pick up with other headphones.
I agree with that, and it's a bit like those gigawatt gigantic power regenerator boxes. They have a way of hyping up the sound so it just sounds almost unreal. The voices and the space in the sound. I kind of agree with him, but the reason why I wanted to do this video was to say that you can easily fix that if you just put a really good CD player as the source, like a minimum, absolute minimum, an ear Acute CD or a Audio Note CD3. That would really help stabilize it, so you get a lot more balance. So you don't want to put a regular CD player feeding signal to this, and you don't want to put any form of streamer. that's just a regular PC or a sound card or something with Tidal or Spotify or a Blue Sound streamer or our Relics or our Render, it's just gonna this thing is just gonna butcher the sound if you do that.
This is incredibly cool, but also a bit strange from time to time.
Yeah.
And this is where part of that detail kicks in, and that's part of what you're hearing is this kind of extra layer on top of what you would normally define as the detail layer. It's kind of like this tertiary layer of detail. It's very cool. Now, it's so detailed, in fact, that this actually has somewhat of a punishing effect with certain music. This headphone is very much surpassing the clarity and detail capability of a lot of songs. A lot of songs that I listen to, you can kind of tell that they're hitting a level that is capped out by the actual recording, which is a very good place to be as a headphone. So 2 treble performances that I freaking loved on this headphone were the Star Wars Episode 7 introduction song, the very first song that you hear, the main title sequence. That song has literally never sounded better. I listened to it on everything. It's been insane on this. And then the other one is the Game of Thrones Light of the Seven song. That song on this, you get the piano. It's beautiful. It's amazing. Now for mid-range, instruments here are among the clearest and best representations of instruments I think I've ever heard throughout the mid-range. It is really exceptional, especially for strings. So you get the dexterity of tonality, you get all the detail, all the crispness, and all the placement benefits of this headphone over something like a Diana 5, for example. That's got all the detail and the tonality and the richness, but it doesn't quite have the placement capability of the 1266. And so you get the richness of cellos, but you get the sweetness of violins and the way that they collaborate and play together. That's one of the things that made that Star Wars introduction song so good, was how clear and defined everything seems. Okay, so vocals are one area that I actually have a slight problem with, and they're actually not my favorite on this. One of the problems with having a sound signature that is this detailed is that specifically within the vocals, they seem a little bit unnatural. They don't seem warm and inviting like real life often can. They seem very detailed, but you can tell that you're listening to a processed version of a human voice and not an actual human voice.
I have to partly agree with what he has to say, but again, that voices and instruments and that glue between the treble, mid-range, and bass is most likely to do with source amplification tubes on the amplification, if it's a tube amplifier, and the cables. All of those things get a hell of a lot better once you deal with that. But yeah, the sound is so ridiculous from the Abyss 1266 model that it could easily fall apart, and going from pop to rock can almost be unbearable sometimes if you're just playing with like a regular Yamaha Denon or Nade CD player. You need really, really, really good gear that's kind of robust and I would say a bit creamy, has a huge amount of characteristics, or else it just falls apart. So yeah.
And there's a little bit of a difference between a super well-defined picture like this offers for vocals, like they're incredibly clear. The tonality is okay. The separation factor is astonishing, but there's something about the way that the top end plays with the kind of S notes and the crispiness of a human voice that you don't normally pick up with your ear when you're talking person to person. But this headphone just displays that in a very detailed but slightly unnatural way to me.
Yeah, but again, those things stick out when you have when you don't have a proper backbone supporting the headphones. So you really want, I mean, I would say a lot of people don't really mention this, but I would say with ridiculously revealing headphones like these that are incredibly detailed and have so much potential, you need 300B amplification amplifier to run a thing like this. I mean, there's no going around it. You can't really use transistor gear on this. Definitely not bright transistor gear. You can't use regular tube, because it just can't, deal with this level of detail. You need a really advanced tube sound, and the 300B triode tube sound is basically the most musical and I wouldn't say forgiving, but it has a lot of characteristics that will tame the sound, make it a hell of a lot better. So for any of you guys watching this video, you need a 300B tube amplifier, and then you need to get some pretty decent tubes with that, and that's going to sound just awesome with this headphone.
Now, there are a few exceptions to this, like May It Be from Enya, vocalists that have kind of a natural sweetness and softness to their voice, and they have a recording that can capture that. This headphone is excellent with. But on the more detailed and more clinical stuff, like Cecile McLaurin Salvant, I think it hits a little bit of an unnatural kind of flavor for me. Now the vocal response here, I think for the kind of high-end price range, I actually prefer something like a LCD4. It's not quite as loose as the Empyrean is, but I think specifically for vocals, I prefer something like an LCD4. It's definitely a thicker sound, but my personal preference aligns with that, even though this is more detailed in the vocal response. Okay, so the bass response is insane.
LCD4 are also just ridiculously good, but also have a very different sound, but just ridiculously good. Yeah.
It does not have the mid-range bloat of something like an LCD4. It doesn't have that thickness to it that the 4 has. This is a very clean, but very deep bass, especially if you position it right. Now, one of the things you can do with this headphone to get more bass is kind of angle the drivers a little bit forward and actually leave a little bit of a gap behind your ear. Not a ton, just a little bit. And the bass hits like so low when you do that. It's still comfortable and it doesn't feel unnatural to wear it like that, but it's real low. It's so low, in fact, that I can feel the driver moving at frequencies that are lower than my human hearing can get to. So, you can kind of feel like 10 hertz, 15 hertz, even though you can't really hear it. Now, a brief comparison to the Diana 5, the bass response on here is far superior to the Diana line. That's one of the big benefits to go with this over the Phi and the V2 is the bass response. It's much deeper. In the price, I would say that if you're like a real bass head, this probably isn't going to be your headphone. It plays bass really well, but if you just want to hear bass, you don't want a ton of top end, there are some headphones that I would probably direct you towards that are not the 1266. But as this stands right now, I think it's a pretty good, very clear representation of bass, and it comes at it from a very fast and ultimately transparent style of bass delivery. Yeah. It's not going to be for everybody, but I think for the right customer, someone who likes the more analytical sound, this is going to be perfect. Okay.
But again, things like this stick out, and when we test equipment, especially when we're testing transistor equipment, you can make a really good potential sound kind of break up and get detail that's too vulgar and separated, and then you start looking into frequency and bumps and all kinds of things like that. I mean, a lot of gear in the world actually sounds pretty decent, but it's all about making it come together and using the intended cable, intended amplification, intended source, or finding something that's close to that sound and then just like moving it, and figuring out, okay, how do I deliver this so it speaks the same language? So it's all about that. I think that basically all people in the world would love this headphone if they could just figure out how to communicate the signal from the source all the way over to the headphone. And that's just a pretty difficult pairing that you have to do, because a lot of people that buy headphones, they just expect that, oh, you're buying a headphone and that's like the main sound, and that, like, this is bright, this is dark, this is linear. No, a lot of the expensive headphones have a lot of hidden potential that most people never get to get close to at all, and then they constantly judge it from a false perspective of like I said before, with it being linear or having a bump or not being able to do this music or that music. No, I mean, once you get up to the class of, I would say, Audi's LCD3 and then you're going slightly up to the Focal Utopia and the LCD4 and this headphone, and then of course the Sennheiser. I mean, you're basically there with all of the phones, the headphones. It's just a question of, cable, amplification, source, and then don't run Tidal, don't run Spotify. That's just gonna again make things come out in pieces. But yeah, once you do that, once you put a 300B tube amplifier, triode tube amplifier on headphones like these, or the Focal Utopia, which is also a very revealing headphone, it just turns into a completely different headphone that is so much better. And it just hurts me inside that no one really gets to hear the full potential of these headphones. I'm like, no. Someone should be telling the people, about the full truth. Not this advertised. This is for this type of person. This is for that. And then, we don't all like the same music. We don't have the same taste. No, we all basically have the same taste of music and like the same gear. It's all about creating the conditions so it's accessible. And I just feel very strongly about this and feel that people need to know this.
So imaging and soundstage, imaging is ludicrous, simply put.
Yeah.
Soundstage is, it is kind of hard to compare, actually. If you were to compare it to something like an HD800, you're almost talking about different soundstaging systems. They play differently. Now, if you're going to measure width, it's not as wide as an HD800. However, it's significantly larger and has significantly more open space and airiness to the sound than the 800 does.
And substance.
And a big reason for that is the delivery of the instruments and the scale of the instruments and the scale of the song itself. So with the 800...
But you can always do that with a lot of high-end hi-fi gear. It's always, powerful, big scale, wide, tall. I mean, who cares, As long as it isn't like completely closed in like an old Audis 2 headphone, those are a bit, on the concerning side, where you're like, this could be a lot bigger. But, again, the cable, when you change the standard cable, it gets twice as big. And then when you put proper amplification to the Audis LCD2, then it goes deeper into the sound stage, and it doesn't play it overly safe. So, I mean, all of these things that he's talking about, they stick out because you don't do a proper matching of tubes and source and cables and all of that. And also, I haven't even talking about power conditioner. When you have a thing like this, you need something like an AudioQuest Niagara 5,000, 7,000, or even better, isolate mini sub access box, because that's the glue that keeps everything together and keeps the detail whole. As soon as you start using high-end gear in a regular way, it almost always falls apart. And it goes with basically all high-end gear, that you have to do this. You have to fill out the holes yourself. You can't buy a thing and then have the thing do everything for you, because you're going to be stuck in your head. It's going to be an Avalon product where it's just going information cut out. It loses its humanity. So good advice for a lot of people.
You're listening to little minute sounds. They're far away. Yes, they've got that soundstage kind of party trick with them, but they're crispy little small notes. This is not that wide, but it's far more open, it's far more spacious, but it's got the scale to the instruments. So a few soundtracks that this was really exceptional with was like the Blade Runner 2049 soundtrack and the new Tenet soundtrack. You just get such a sense of
these soundtracks,
just massiveness to this that I have not really seen on too many other headphones, and definitely not on, I wouldn't say anything has gotten quite to this level of scale. So I would even say, while not technically as wide as some other headphones, I think this is probably the best representation of staging I think I've heard in an open in a given space, while providing probably close to the most realistic scale of the instruments for a headphone. Now, there are actually a few things that make this possible. Texture, space, separation, frequency response, details, and speed all play a big role in providing
Very fast.
the wide open space that this has. And it's how all those layers play together that is the thing that allows the magic to happen. And it really breathes life into those large scale albums in a way that not too many other headphones can. A few get close, but this is probably the best representation of that side of staging that I've heard. So I did write down the section called Dynamics, and all I put was yes. That's all you need to know. It's got it. It's very good for that. Okay, now I want to compare this against the Diana 5 and the Diana V2. So in some ways, these are very similar headphones. In other ways, they're actually very different. Tonality is something that is similar between all three. I would say the V2 is definitely the warmest. The Fi is probably the thinnest in tonality, and the 1266 is actually somewhere in between. It's probably the most dexterous too. So if you play a warm song through it, you're going to get a really warm experience. But if you play, a super crispy, thin song through it, you're going to get that experience. The Fi and the V2 are not bad, especially for the price. They're actually really good at that. But this is a little bit better at being a little bit more wide-ranging. Now, above all, I think the most significant changes between these headphones is the space that is afforded with the 1266 that is not available on the V2 or the Fi. This headphone is significantly wider than both of those, and you can hear it right away. And that actually allows for a lot of the staging type songs to seem a lot more natural than on the V2. The V2 is a very headphoney type sound. It's kind of all happening in your head. This couldn't be further from the 1266. I do think there are some legitimate benefits to an intimate sound signature like that, though. And the sound signature that the V2 has in some ways is even better than the 1266, specifically things like vocals. No, they're not as detailed as the 1266, but the tonality is just, in my opinion, a lot better for me personally. Now, when it comes to the Diana Fi, I don't feel like that headphone is an inherently inferior product. It, to me, sounds like a very different take on music, but not necessarily a better or a worse take. The 1266 is a little bit wider, as you would expect. It's a little bit clearer than you would expect.
But yeah, I also have to mention that, though, you can't, Abyss is just a totally different brand when you're talking about the low models. It's the same with Focal and Sennheiser, It's just, I'm one of those type of people that just can't listen to bottom models of any brand, if it's Biodynamic, Sennheiser, or these Focal, Abyss, or whatever brand. It's just, you always get this feeling that it's sitting on the sound and it's kind of numb, but it's still separated and there's some detail, but it's just not coming out of the headphone. So this is just like a completely different headphone, period. It's I would say the second best headphone in the world, and I think there's really only like 3 important headphones in the world, and that's the Orpheus, or HE1 as it's called, this one here, the Abyss 1266, and then the Focal, Utopia, and a 4th one. I would say then there's like the Odys LCD3, the original one, not the new one, the original one. The new one is also good, but it's just more analytical, and you can fix that with tube amplification. Those are the headphones that I consider relevant, where it's like, those are headphones that you keep for life, where you keep on digging and digging and digging and digging, and it just goes on forever. You can just discover, for each day that passes by, you discover new layers of detail. It's just sound that you have forever. So if you're looking at this video, and you might even consider not having a complete sound system, I'd recommend any of these 4 headphones that I just mentioned, and then just use some kind of a 300B triode headphone tube amplifier, and then make sure, don't go cheap, but make sure you have a proper power box, like an Isolate mini sub access. That's like the best value power box ever on the market. And then make sure you have a source that's at least at the level of an ear acoustic CD player. And I mean, those things are like 15 years old. Those CD players, I think the original ones. No, don't settle with anything lower than that. And if you're going, if you want something that's significantly better, take an Audio Note CD3. But don't settle with anything lower than that. That's gonna sound awesome on these headphones. And yeah, you can just take it directly from the CD over to the amp, but you can make it, of course, even better by like having something like an Audio Note DAC 2.1 signature. You don't need anything bigger than a 2.1 signature. Just make sure it's a real Audio Note, not a kit or anything that's 15, 20 years old. Make sure it's proper, and then that's your setup. That's your setup for life. You don't need anything better than that. I mean, you can make small tweaks here, there. You can change some cables, and all of that. But that's like the headphone setup for life. You just need those 4 headphones. I mean, there are other options that are interesting, that have potential. But I would say like those 4 headphones, those are like the relevant ones that are the true representation of what top headphone sound has to offer. And they're all really expensive. So good luck getting that. But I would have to say that the Orpheus or the HE1 or whatever it's called, I mean that's clearly not a choice that anybody down to earth can make. It's up there. It's too pricey. I think it's like £54,000. So that's crazy. And this here, I don't know what it is, like a fourth of the price, but fifth of the price or something like that. So this is probably the highest level of sound you can get, and I would say that the sound from this headphone is very similar to a Verity Sarastro speaker. It has a lot of similarities, especially because of that treble, that insane treble, and really good bass, and very fast and fantastic mid-range. This is like owning a Verity Sarastro speaker, seriously. But only if you make sure that amplification source, cables, power box, all of that is in place. You'll basically get that type of sound. And the Utopia, Focal Utopia, I mean, it's like once you have that set properly up, it's like owning a really good $100,000 system, speaker system in a 30, 40, 50 square meter room. It can be that. You can make that happen for a fraction of the price if you want to go this route. And I think that's all I kind of have to say with this headphone. Let's just see if he has more to say.
But the HIFI does have some legitimate benefits over the 1266, similar to how the V2 does. And that mostly just comes down to how the vocals are represented and how the song itself and the staging itself is represented for each individual song. So this headphone, taking really personally recorded music and throwing it into a big wide open space, doesn't always work for this specific headphone, but it may play really well on the HIFI or the V2, and vice versa. Really open songs may not sound as good on the HIFI and V2, but sound exceptional on the 1266. I would say that if you were to go like pound for pound, I would love the 1266 sound in like a Diana build, but I think it's part of the build that allows for the 1266 sound to happen. And then bass, I think, is a clear winner for the 1266.
Yeah.
So my conclusions, this is a exceptional headphone. It is a truly exceptional headphone, and I mean that wholeheartedly. I do wish I had more time with it. Above all, I would say that this headphone is a master of clarity and a master of detail retrieval. And I think if I were to assign like a catchphrase to the 1266, it would be Abyss 1266, miss nothing, because that's exactly how this sounds. You really don't feel like you're missing out on anything at all. Everything's in the picture. I think the build,
And let's just end the video on that note. And remember to like and subscribe. Bye.